This video will serve as your introduction to writing responses to the FRQs you're going to see this year in AP Government. In this video, I'm going to talk to you about the different type of FRQ questions, and I'm also going to give you some general tips about writing them, regardless of which type they are. Let's start by putting the FRQs in context of the overall exam. So the AP Government exam is divided into two parts. The first part you'll do is the multiple choice part, 55 mostly stimulus-based questions in 80 minutes. That is worth 50% of your overall exam score, and we will definitely do a lot of practice with multiple choice throughout the year to get you ready for that part. But after a short break, you'll then begin the FRQ part, the writing part. In this section, you'll answer 4 FRQ questions, free response questions, all of which are required. So you have no choice in this part. You'll be given 4 questions and you need to answer all 4 questions. You'll have a total of 100 minutes to answer these questions, and it's a free-flowing 100 minutes. So if you spend more time on one, that's okay. You'll just have a little less on the others. But this section is also worth 50% of your exam score. So you can see this is as important as the multiple choice. And for many students who hope to do well on the AP exam, but maybe don't get the score that they want, it's usually because while they're strong in their knowledge of the content and they've developed good multiple choice skills, they haven't quite mastered the writing skills that they need to do well in this part. So this video will give you a lot of tips that'll help you write better FRQs, and then I will follow with individual videos on each of the 4 types so that you can become an expert on each type. Let's talk about those 4 types now. So this can look a little overwhelming at first, and that's why I'm going to introduce you to each type one at a time. In no particular order, although on the AP exam you may see them in this order, we may not learn them in this order. But the first type is called concept application. It's probably the most basic type of question you'll see. You're going to be given a real life scenario. Sometimes it's a newspaper article or a description of something that has actually happened in government. And you're going to be asked to apply government concepts to that scenario. This question really just seeks to see if you know how government works. Okay, so a lot of the things we learn about how the government operates are going to be applied to this type of question. So like I said, it's the most basic type. The next type is called quantitative analysis. Here you're dealing with some sort of data. It might be a chart or a graph, a data table, something numeric. Sometimes it's a map that explains different data. And you'll be asked to describe the data, but also explain it and be able to relate it to government. Maybe explain why the data is the way it is based on concepts in government that you learn. The next type is probably the most unique type. It's called SCOTUS comparison. And SCOTUS, if you don't know by now, is an acronym that stands for Supreme Court of the United States. So early in the year, I told you that there are 15 Supreme Court decisions that you must know and must know well. And this is a big part of the reason why. In this type of FRQ, you're going to be introduced briefly to a Supreme Court case and decision that is not one of those 15 must-know cases. And then you're going to be asked to compare that case and the decision in that case to one of the ones that you do know. So while they'll give you all the information you need on this new case, it's going to be your knowledge of the must-know case that's going to help you do a good job here. And then finally, the 4th type is what is called the argument essay question. Now, I hesitate to even use the word essay. When students hear the word essay, they think, maybe more like something you'd write in a history class, a many paragraphed essay with an introduction and a strong thesis and a conclusion. That's not exactly what you're doing here. In this type of FRQ, you're going to be asked to make a claim about government. So that is kind of like a thesis, but your options are going to be rather limited and pretty apparent to you. You know, hypothetically, I'm making this up, but they might ask a question like, you know, which branch of the government is the most powerful in America today? And it's not going to be a question that broad, but that might be the gist of it. And obviously, you have three options. Any one of them could be right. What they want to see in this type of FRQ is, can you support that claim that you're making about government? Can you use some of the knowledge you've learned throughout the year to defend the argument that Congress is the most powerful branch of government? Now, you'll notice there that for this type of FRQ, it's going to require you to have knowledge of must-know historical documents. So throughout the year, I'll be introducing you to some very important documents, many of which we'll read or we'll examine quite carefully, and you're going to have to demonstrate your knowledge of those documents, at least in part, as you answer this question. Now, if you've looked ahead, you see that each of the 4 FRQs is equally weighted, and each one makes up about 12.5% of your overall exam score. Now, I don't want to put a lot of pressure on you this early in the year, but that means that each of these FRQs is about 1/8 of the exam. And so to completely bomb one of these FRQs, all but guarantees you're not going to get a 5. So that is why we take writing very seriously. We'll introduce each one individually. We'll practice these types, and you want to take the tips that I'm about to give you very seriously. You also see that of that 100 minutes, it's recommended that you spend about 20 on each of the first 3 types and a little more on that last type. Remember, this is a free-flowing period, so that's up to you how you want to spend your time. But they're suggesting that that last type is a little more involved and will take a little more time to think about and to write. So far, since the exam has changed to this format, I have not really encountered many students who found 100 minutes wasn't enough. So don't worry about the time right now. Let's worry about getting good at writing FRQs. So let's start and look at some general tips for writing these. Some of these are very, very important, and I'll develop and elaborate. Some are pretty easy statements that I want you to take seriously. I want you to do them, but they don't require much explanation. Now, this may sound obvious, but read the entire question, all of its parts, before you write a word. You'll see that most FRQs are broken down into parts. Most of them have 3 parts, an A, B, and C. The argument essay might have a little more. Read it all before you begin to formulate a response or write a word. Get a feel for the whole question. See what part B wants you to do before you write part A, because some students will put into part A what they're being asked to do in part B, and that just kind of is a waste of time. It's extra work. But more importantly, read the whole question so you get a feel for it. It'll make more sense to you if you read it all at the beginning. And again, trust me when I say you will have the time. When you look at the various parts of the question, circle or underline keywords, especially what I like to call the task of the essay, or the task of the FRQ, the verb that's telling you what to do. I've given you, or I will be giving you, a handout, should be on gold paper, and it lists many of these task words. Make sure you understand what those mean. I find myself spending a lot of time with students teaching them what it means when a question says explain. To explain is not the same as to simply describe. So really make sure you understand these task words and you recognize which one is in each part of the question. Also circle or underline, key government vocabulary or concepts. Let those words really jump out at you because they're clues to how you want to answer the question. Definitely spend a few minutes planning your response. I'm always amazed at how many students read the question and then start right in on writing. It's been proven time and again that if you take a few minutes to really think and plan out your response, maybe jotting a few notes, the writing is a lot easier. But when you dive into the writing, now you get confused. You don't have that roadmap to follow. So take a few minutes to plan. It's well worth it. And again, trust me when I say you will have the time. The question is broken up into many parts. Answer each part of the question if you can, even if you're not sure. Each part earns a separate point. So even if part A, you look at and you're like, I'm not sure at all, I don't think I'm going to get this point. That doesn't mean you might not get the point in B or C. So make sure you answer each part of the question. Take a shot at it even if you aren't sure. Get partial credit even if you don't get full credit. If you get partial credit on one, but you do much, much better on the other three, you're still in great shape. And then this may sound trivial, but it's important as well. You're going to want to label your response. Now, remember, if you were writing an essay in a history class, you wouldn't label your response. You would write it and maybe use paragraphs and skip space between each paragraph or indent each paragraph. But here you want to label it exactly the way the question is labeled. We do this for a couple of reasons. One, it shows that we're answering all parts. It also helps the reader of your FRQ see what you're trying to do in each part. I'm going to give you a very important secret and piece of advice. When you're done taking the exam and your responses are sent off to wherever they're going to be scoring the exam that year, someone, not me, someone who is called a reader for the exam is going to read your FRQs. Now, each of your 4 FRQs will be read by someone different. But each person who reads your FRQ, that person who's going to read it, is going to spend perhaps no more than 1 minute reading what you might have spent 20 minutes writing. They are so well trained how to score these that they can look at them very quickly and give an accurate score. But what I like to remind students is these people are humans, and they are going to be looking at hundreds, maybe 1,000 of these in a day, every day for a couple of weeks. They don't know you. They don't know what you know. And therefore, what we want to do is make their job easy. So one of the things, I'm not sure if it's one of my bullet points or not, but write neatly, especially important words. You know, if you write the word and you scribble it, and it's really hard to tell if that's an N or an M in the middle, it'll be okay. But if you're writing a word or a phrase, or you have a sentence that you know, this sentence is really the heart of my answer, write it neatly. Because if they cannot read it at all, they cannot give you credit. Likewise, as I'm saying here, we're going to label with letters so they can see where you're earning the points. You're making it easier for them to say, oh, okay, this is part A. I know what you're supposed to do in part A. Here's where you're doing it good. You've got the point. I also recommend that you skip spaces between each part. A couple, 3. 1, this leaves you some room if you need to go back and add something in later. When you're writing them for me, it gives me some room to go in there and make some comments. But it also helps the reader see, okay, there's the end of part A. Now you're skipping space, you're moving on to part B. Remember, they're going to look at this very quickly. Help them find your answer so that they can give you the point. On the AP exam, you're required to write your FRQs in ink pen, blue or black. And throughout the year, I will ask you to also write in blue or black ink pen to get into that habit. Now, I know a lot of you are accustomed to writing everything in pencil, probably so that you can erase. When you're writing in pen and you make a mistake, a misspelling, or you write a couple sentences and you're like, those are terrible, I don't want to use those, you simply draw a single line through it and you move on. We don't want to waste any time, so we just cross it out and move on. The AP readers will not read anything that has a line through it. Okay, so we're going to get into that habit of writing in ink so that on exam day, we're used to it. All right, here I wanted to show you a sample question, and this is of the concept application type. So in separate videos, I'll be showing you different sample FRQs of other types. But I wanted you to get a feel for what these look like. So in concept application, remember, there's a real life scenario that is described for you. It might be a newspaper article or a summary of a past event in government, and that's what you see at the top in italics. And then the questions are broken down A, B, and C. Now we're going to break this down a little bit more later, but I wanted to also show you that, in part A, remember I said circle or underline keywords. So here the task verb is describe. So we want to make sure we're describing. We're not just naming something, we're describing it. Well, what are we describing? It says here a section of the Constitution. So a very specific part of the Constitution is going to be our answer that we're going to describe. Then it says that that section of the Constitution is one that a group such as the ACLU would likely say is most affected by the Patriot Act. So we might underline ACLU, Patriot Act. And as you read the passage, you'll get a little better sense of why they mention the ACLU and the Patriot Act. They're both mentioned in the passage. But again, the keywords are describe and section of the Constitution. We want to make sure that that's what we're talking about. That's what we're describing. In part B, the task verb is explain. So when we explain, and you'll again see this on that gold handout, explain means we have to show how something works or why something happens the way it did. We don't just describe something, we explain a process. So I think it's always a good idea whenever you see the word explain to ask yourself, explain what? What exactly am I explaining? What process or what relationship? Sometimes it's a cause and effect relationship. Am I developing? Okay. So as we continue to look at part B, it says explain how checks and balances. So I would circle that. Okay, what are checks and balances? I got to be able to know what that is and probably describe that in my response. But I have to explain how checks and balances could work to ensure that the section of the Constitution I identified in Part A, so B is connecting to Part A. I've already identified a section of the Constitution in Part A. Now I have to explain how checks and balances would ensure that that section would be protected. So I have to show the relationship between checks and balances and protecting this part of the Constitution that I came up with in Part A. Okay? Note, I'm not going to do that in one sentence. I'm going to have to show that I know what checks and balances are. I might have to use a specific example of one that relates to this scenario. I'm going to have to explain how checks and balances or that particular check would ensure that this section of the Constitution is protected. Okay, this is going to be done in many sentences. All right, we'll come back to this sample FRQ, but let's talk about some more general writing tips. We're always going to write in complete sentences. Okay? Never will one word or a phrase suffice as an answer. Even if the first question says identify. Okay, notice in our sample FRQ it says describe a section of the Constitution. So to describe is going to require a sentence or two. But even if it said just identify a section, you wouldn't simply name it. We would write a complete sentence that says, maybe something like one section of the Constitution that the ACLU would say is affected by the Patriot Act is this. Remember, this is not an essay, so you probably have seen that now. You're just answering the questions directly. So in part A, we're going to write several sentences that address that question. Then in part B, we're going to write several sentences that address that part of the question. This is not an essay that is going to kind of be tied all together necessarily, or that's going to flow like an essay. answer the questions that are asked, answer them thoroughly, and then move on to the next part. This is something that I often have a hard time helping students with. I'm still trying to figure out the right way to say this. But I say, you have to answer what is asked, even if it seems obvious. You're in these FRQs, you're being given a chance to show the reader what you know. Now, you don't have to include things that are irrelevant to the question, but you want to make sure that you're not leaving anything to chance. What I mean by that is, by the time we get to the end of the year, there are going to be so many things in government that are just so basic, so obvious, that I know you know, and you wouldn't take the time to explain them because they're a given. All right, we know this stuff. That's fine if we're having a conversation about government, but in an FRQ, you have to put into writing to really a complete stranger who's going to read this what you know. So show them what you know. Don't leave something out because, well, that's obvious, or I just assumed they knew that. Show them what you know. Okay. I have a tip, and it'll come up a couple different times, but I always say, write as if your reader is like 3 years old. And maybe I don't mean that literally, but the reason I say write to a 3-year-old is because 3-year-olds love to ask why. They love to always, ask more. They're hungry to know more. And so you want to spell this out to a 3-year-old. You want to, don't be afraid to sound like you're talking down to the reader. That's how you need to write these to show you know. I always joke, I say you should think of a 3-year-old, give him or her a name, someone you can almost talk to in your head when you're writing these. For reasons I cannot explain, I've named mine Timmy. So, sometimes when I'm explaining this to students, I'll say, I'm going to start out, it's the first question was, describe a section of the Constitution that the ACLU would say is affected. Well, if my answer is, as it should be, the Fourth Amendment's protection against unreasonable searches and seizures, that would be probably the best answer to Part A, which we'll study late in the year. But I would almost in my head say, well, you see, Timmy, in the Constitution is the Fourth Amendment. And the Fourth Amendment protects us from unreasonable searches and seizures by the government. The ACLU would be afraid that the Patriot Act would infringe on that protection. You see, Timmy, the Patriot Act allows the federal government to access phone and email communications, often without approval from a judge. The Fourth Amendment says that in order for the government to search our phone records or our emails or anything, they need a warrant issued by a judge. So you see, Timmy, the ACLU would be worried that the Patriot Act will affect or infringe on that protection in the Constitution's Fourth Amendment. Okay? Now, I would never write Timmy's name in my response, but that helps me show what I know, show what is obvious, maybe to others. It helps me to really spell out my response. A couple more tips. You want to be very clear in your answer. And you kind of just saw that in the way I talked through that response to Part A. What I mean by being clear in your answer is avoid writing really long, complex sentences that try to do too much. It is so much better to write in several short sentences that don't do too much. Again, write as if you're explaining this to a 3-year-old. Give them a little bit at a time. No matter how many times I say this, I will still read students' FRQs where their response to any part is one big long sentence. And it's trying to do too much. And what happens when you do that is you get confused or it's hard to follow. Remember, if the reader doesn't understand what you're saying, they can't give you the point. There's no points for writing at a high grammatical level, writing these really great complex sentences that maybe would make your English teacher stand and applaud. The AP Government Reader is not giving you any style points. It's not a test of your writing. It's a test of your knowledge of how the government works. And whether you explain that at a, graduate college level, or you explain it at a fourth grade level, if what you're explaining is correct, you're going to get the point. So write in several short sentences. Use government vocabulary. Don't talk about government concepts in an abstract way. Use the vocabulary you've been learning all year. So if you're talking about the president's power to veto a law, say that. The president has the power to veto a law. Don't say that guy who lives in the White House can he can say no when Congress makes one of those rule things. Okay, that's not government vocabulary. Clarity in writing is using the right words. Next, don't include extraneous information. Don't include things that are irrelevant to the question just because you want to show off. Now, I said show what you know. But don't show everything you know. Okay, don't include things where you're like, oh, I know this, and I want to show the reader I know this. It's not getting you a point. Answer the question as it's asked, nothing more. And this last tip is a good one. Avoid the use of pronouns. A lot of students will start to write, and maybe they're talking about Congress and interest groups. And after maybe mentioning them both at the beginning, they continue to refer to them as they throughout the rest of their response. So, interest groups can support Congress by providing campaign contributions to members of Congress seeking re-election. They do this because they want them. See, when you use pronouns a lot, sometimes the reader doesn't know which group, which proper noun, Congress or interest groups, does that pronoun they refer to. In your head, you do. But when the reader reads it, they're like, I don't know which one you're talking about. And if you're talking about this one, you're wrong. So I think it's best to avoid pronouns as much as possible. If you say, well, I just wrote the word Congress 16 times in this response, that's okay. If that's what you meant, Congress, everyone will know. But if you just keep saying they, or he, or it, no one knows who you're talking about. All right, back to our sample FRQ. I wanted to show you a little bit more about how to write these responses. So I'm going to show you a sample response for A and B. And I want to point out some of the things that I've just shared with you in this video. So remember, in part A, it says describe a section of the Constitution that a group like the ACLU would say is most affected by the Patriot Act. So notice in this first sentence, all I'm doing is identifying a section of the Constitution. The ACLU would likely say that the Patriot Act could infringe on the Fourth Amendment's protection against unreasonable search and seizures. If I stopped right there, I have not answered this question. I did not really describe it or really even show why the ACLU would think that section of the Constitution would be affected. I've just identified it. But I have to do that first. I have to get that out there first. But I'm doing that in one simple sentence. I know I could go on and make this sentence more complex and describe it with identifying it. But remember, we want to write in short, simple sentences. Now, I guess I just broke my law, my own rule. I said they. But I think it's clear that they, in this case, refers to the ACLU. They're the only group I've talked about so far. But certainly, I could start this sentence. The ACLU would feel this way because the law broadens the federal government's ability to access phone and email records without a warrant issued by a judge. So there, after identifying the section of the Constitution, now I'm kind of showing why the ACLU would think that Fourth Amendment would be affected by this law. I still really haven't described that section. I've identified the Fourth Amendment, but I haven't really described it. So in one last sentence, that's what I'm doing. The Fourth Amendment protects citizens against unreasonable searches and seizures by requiring valid warrants for government searches. So by now, it's clear to say in 3 fairly simple sentences, I've described a section of the Constitution that a group like the ACLU would say is affected by the Patriot Act. I've shown why they would think that. I've identified that section. And then at the end, I described it. Okay. So that wouldn't take me long to write. And that's going to earn me that point for sure. If I stopped after the first sentence, which believe me, many students would do, they'd be like, well, I identified the section. I might not get the point because it's not clear why the ACLU would feel this way. And I really didn't describe it. I need all 3 sentences. Look now at part B. Explain how checks and balances could work to ensure that that Fourth Amendment would be protected. Well, I start out by simply defining what checks and balances are. Okay, before I explain how they could ensure that the Fourth Amendment is protected, I want to show that I know what checks and balances are, a very generic definition. Checks and balances are provisions in the Constitution that allow each branch of government to limit the power of the other 2. Now, that doesn't answer the question, but it gets it started. I'm going to talk about checks and balances, so I'm going to tell you what they are. Now, I go on to say, although Congress has the power to pass a law like the Patriot Act, the president has the power to veto any law that he or she believes is unconstitutional. Actually, the president can veto a law for any reason. They don't like it, they don't agree with it, but really should use the power of the veto if they think that law is unconstitutional. So in this second sentence, I'm now giving a specific example of a check and balance that relates to this scenario. Since Congress passed a law that maybe violates the Constitution, the ACLU might think it does, I'm pointing out that, well, there's a check that the president has that could be used to ensure that the Fourth Amendment is protected and to knock down that law. But now I finish this up. I want to show how this particular check, veto power, could be used to ensure that the Fourth Amendment is protected. So this last sentence is what's really going to earn me the point. Therefore, the president's check on Congress could be used to veto the law and prevent it from being passed. This would ensure that the Fourth Amendment's protection against unreasonable searches and seizures is protected. So those last couple of sentences are where I'm really explaining how checks and balances would protect the Fourth Amendment, or our right to be free of unreasonable searches and seizures that's mentioned in the Fourth Amendment. But it's those first 2 sentences that are setting me up to do that by defining checks and balances and then by giving an example of one. Okay? So these 2, I think these are 2 good examples of what we would call a well-developed response. Not one simple sentence that barely describes or barely explains. Not one really long sentence that tries to do it all. Several short, simple sentences that really develop the response, that do describe, that do explain, and that are very clear. Anyone reading this would say, even if they didn't understand government, would say, okay, that makes sense. I get it. All right. So I will wrap up this video there. As I mentioned, each of the 4 types of FRQs will be further explained in individual videos on each one. But I hope this provided you with a lot of tips that will help you write good FRQs all year.